Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us today for the Internal Validation Module webinar. My name is Melody Harris, and I'm one of the validation analysts for the NTD's Urban team. I'm joined by Courtney Springer, a validation analyst for the Rural team, who will also be presenting during today's webinar. If you have any questions as we go through our presentation, please feel free to use the Q&A feature at the bottom of the screen, like Lori explained. As a disclaimer, please note that the contents of this presentation do not have the force and effect of law and are not meant to bind the public in any way. This presentation is intended only to provide clarity to the public regarding existing requirements under the law or agency policies. Grantees and subgrantees should refer to FDA statutes and regulations for applicable National Transit Database requirements. Here you will see email addresses for Courtney and myself, along with contact information for the NTD Help Desk. If you ever have any questions about your report or the validation process, your assigned analyst should be your first contact. If they are not available, the Help Desk should be your next stop, as someone is always monitoring the inbox during these listed hours. Here's the agenda for this afternoon. First, we will talk about the purpose of data validation in the context of the National Transit Database. We will take a look at the summary dashboard and then how to view and resolve issues within the reporting system. We will also discuss the different types of validation issues as well as how to complete validation generally. Courtney will then take us through the 10 most common validation issues that we see during reporting. We will review the closeout process, and we will wrap up the presentation by answering questions if we have extra time. Please note that today's presentation is not designed to offer reporting guidance for agency-specific validation issues. The Q&A feature can be used to request clarification on the contents of this webinar or general reporting requirements. If you would like to discuss a specific validation issue that has appeared on your agency's prior NTD reports, please contact your analyst. First, we'll take a look at validation in general and talk about why it's important. So let's talk about the National Transit Database. You will most often hear this referred to as the NTD. The NTD records financial, operating, and asset data of transit systems across the country. Its purpose is to provide information and statistics for public use. The data provided by the NTD is used to support planning efforts, and it also helps make multi-year comparisons and trend analyses. If you have ever viewed this data on the NTD website, you will know that the transit data is available by year, and we also offer some time series data for easier comparison across longer time frames. Data collected by the NTD is used for formula apportionments, such as sections 5307, 5337, and 5339 for urbanized areas, state safety oversight, rural formula, and tribal formula. Data is also used for the Conditions and Performance Report, the Government Performance Results Act, performance benchmarking, and academic research. During the reporting process, all submitted data is validated by the NTD team to ensure the accuracy of the data being collected. This data is published publicly and is frequently used by a variety of people, including individuals, agencies, and universities, for general knowledge and research purposes. In addition, NTD data is used for the apportionment of funding to urbanized and rural areas, so it's important to make sure that we are collecting and publishing the most accurate data possible. During validation, we review submitted data in several different ways. The first of these is to compare current data against the data that was submitted the prior year to see if there have been any significant changes during the current report year. Logic checks are also performed between data on different forms. For example, if you report new vehicles on your asset inventory, we would expect to see capital expenses reported on your F20 or RR20 forms, depending on which type of reporter you are. In addition, there are range checks that compare your data to values that are typically reported by transit agencies with similar operating characteristics. This is especially applicable to agencies who are reporting data for the first year, as there is no prior year data that can be compared against current data. There are set time frames that determine when reports and revisions are due. Your fiscal year determines the due date of your original submission, as we will see on the next slide. After that original submission, these are the turnaround times for any subsequent revisions. First revision should be completed within 3 weeks for state DOTs and within 2 weeks for all other reporter types. Second revision should be completed within 2 weeks for state DOTs and 1 week for all other reporter types. Third revisions are given 3 days for all reporter types, and fourth or higher revisions are given 1 day for completion. As I mentioned, your fiscal year determines the due date of your original submission. Original submissions are due either on October 31st, January 31st, or April 30th. The closeout deadline, which is the date by which any updates or revisions must be complete so your report can be closed out, is also based on your fiscal year. As you see here, for October reporters, that date is March 1st. For January reporters, it is May 1st. And for April reporters, it is July 2nd. Next, we will take a look at the summary dashboard within the reporting system, which will lead us into reviewing the validation module. You will find the summary dashboard on the report package summary page. The dashboard indicates if a form has been validated or if it requires validation. Forms that have already been validated will be coded green, and forms that require validation will be coded red, as you see in the example here. When you are working within your annual forms, you will see these options. The Save option simply saves any data that you have updated on the form. You can enter partial data for a form, save, and come back to complete the form later. The Save and Validate option applies the rules of validation to all current data. After completing a form and selecting Save and Validate, the validated flag on the summary dashboard will turn green. As you can see here, 3 of these forms have been saved and validated. When all forms have been successfully validated, all validation flags will be green. All forms must be validated before the report can be submitted. If a form is resaved after being validated, the validation flag will revert back to red, and the form will need to be revalidated. In addition to the validated column on the summary dashboard, you also have an open issues column and a total issues column. The total issues column lists the number of total issues that have been raised on each form during the validation process. The open issues column lists the number of open issues that currently need to be addressed. We will now discuss how to view and resolve issues within the reporting system. There are 2 different ways to view issues, either by viewing all issues at once or by viewing issues on each individual form. To view issues for the entire report package, you will use the View Issues button on the report package summary. When using this option, issues for all forms will be available for review. This is helpful if you would like to see all issues at once instead of going form by form. Issues can also be viewed for each individual form by selecting the View Issues option. You can find that at the bottom of each form beside the Save and Validate and Save options. When you select View Issues on a form, you will only see issues that have been raised on that specific form. When viewing issues, there are several filters to refine your view of existing issues. These are available when viewing all issues or issues on individual forms, but some filters apply only when viewing all issues. You can see these filters here, and we are going to take a look at each one. Filter by status allows you to choose which status type you would like to view. Status types include all open, open, and open with explanation, which are issues that require a resolution prior to report submission. If you want to see which issues still need to be addressed, you can use this filter to view only those issues which still need attention. Filter by status also includes all closed, closed, and closed with data revision, which are issues that have been resolved and will not affect report submission. During the reporting process, all issues are saved and can be reviewed, even if they have been closed. We'll take a closer look at these issue types later in the presentation. Filter by module allows you to view issues for specific NTD reporting modules. For example, selecting assets will filter to the issues related to the asset module, which includes the A10, A15, A30, and A35. You will see some different modules listed here. This is helpful if you would like to focus on one module at a time when addressing issues. Filter by form allows you to view issues for specific report forms. This only applies when viewing all report issues. Filter by mode allows you to view issues for specific modes of service. This applies when viewing all report issues, but also applies to forms that contain data for multiple modes. For example, if you have a demand response and a bus mode, and you would like to review only issues that affect the demand response mode, you can use this filter to view issues only for demand response. Filter by criticality allows you to choose the nature of the issues you would like to view. The options here are critical, which require a data revision to resolve, or important, which can be resolved with either a data revision or an explanation. And the last one is filter by subrecipient, which is for state DOTs. With this filter, you can view issues related to each designated subrecipient assigned to your state. Now that we've discussed how to view issues, we will talk about how to resolve them. For some issues, important issues, as I briefly mentioned a couple of slides back, an explanation is the appropriate way to resolve the issue. These can be resolved by explaining changes in data, such as data variances compared to prior years, data that falls outside of the typical range, or the procurement of new assets. If an open issue can be addressed with an explanation, you will enter this explanation into the comment box and select Save, as seen here. After saving a comment, the issue status will change from open to open with explanation. During validation, your analyst will review the comment to make sure that it sufficiently addresses the issue. If it does, your analyst will close the issue. If it does not, your analyst will request more information. Some issues can't be resolved with a comment and require a data revision to resolve. If you have entered data incorrectly, this must be revised on the related form rather than noted in a comment. Additionally, critical issues must be addressed with a data revision rather than an explanation. If you have an issue that requires a revision, you can access the form directly by selecting View Related Form at the bottom of the issue. Once in the form, you can make any needed changes and then save and validate from there. If this data revision resolves a validation issue, then the issue will close automatically, but only if it was system generated. If the issue was raised manually by your analyst, a comment will still be needed, even if you have revised the data. We will discuss manually added validation issues a little later. As of report year 2023, you can access your final validation file in the eFile library. This file contains last year's validation correspondence, including all issues that existed on the report, as well as all comments that were made by you and your analyst. The eFile library can be found in your reporter profile, and you will filter the type to final validation to locate this. If you would like to see your final validation files for years prior to 2023, contact your analyst and we can provide that for you. We will now take a look at the different types of validation issues. Open issues must be addressed prior to the report submission. These can be resolved with a comment or a data revision, depending on the issue. In the example here, you will see that open issues have a comment box where an explanation can be provided about the issue. Issues that are open with explanation have already been addressed with a comment. These will be reviewed by your analyst during the validation process. Here you can see the issue as well as the comment that was entered to explain the data. Issues are updated to closed when your analyst has reviewed your explanation and determined that it explains the changes in your data. In the example here, you will see that the analyst has commented on the issue, confirming that the agency's explanation sufficiently explained the change in data. If you revise data in order to close an issue, and this revision successfully addresses the change in data, then the issue status will change to closed with data revision. This occurs automatically for system-generated issues. If your analyst raises the issue manually, they will have to update the status during validation. If you notice that you have updated the data and the issue hasn't closed, it is best to double check that you have saved and validated the form and that the changes are showing correctly. If so, you will then leave a comment on the issue explaining these changes. Courtney will also discuss this a little more later on in the presentation. Here you can see an issue with a status that has been updated to closed with data revision. If you open one of these issues, there will be no option to leave a comment since the issue has already been resolved. And with that, I will turn the rest of the presentation over to Courtney.
All right, great. Thank you so much, Melody. All right. Good afternoon, everyone. Again, my name is Courtney Springer, and in this section, we will review how users can interact with NTD validation while completing their annual reports. So as Melody mentioned, as you save and validate your annual report forms, open validation issues will begin to generate in the report package. In order to officially submit the report, you must address all of the open issues beforehand. In the screenshot shown on this slide, all of the forms have been saved and validated, but there are some outstanding open issues shown in the open issues column. As you complete the original submission of the report, which is the first draft, all of the issues that fire in your forms will be automated, system-generated issues. Your analyst cannot manually add issues to the report while the report is in your view. We will look at 3 different validation issues that fire in this sample original submission, as well as how the analyst would likely respond during the review and how the issues would appear during the first report revision. In our first example, you reported exactly $10,000 to the field local funds in your financial data. The reporting system typically fires a validation check when it detects rounded values, just to ensure that the total represents the exact expenditure during the year and not a value that was erroneously rounded during reporting. So during the original submission, you address this issue by entering a comment that confirms your agency spent exactly $10,000 from local sources during the year. So that's our first example issue. In our second example, a validation issue fired on the B15 geographic area coverage form. Question 10 of this form asks for the most commonly charged fare for a demand response service for which you entered $0. The validation check that fired here asks you to either report your demand response fare if you meant to report a non-zero value or confirm that $0 is correct. You enter a comment confirming that this is correct. As a hint, looking ahead, on your RR20 report form, you reported a non-zero value for passenger paid fares for demand response, which creates a conflict with the B15 data. Keep this in mind for when we look at the analyst review. In our third example, you allocated maintenance facilities across multiple A10 forms, but the total number of facilities came out to 1.25 when you meant to report 1. So facilities must always equal a whole number when you report allocated facilities across more than one A10 form. For example, the 1.25 value may have come from erroneously reporting 0.75 facilities on one form and 0.5 on another. Since this issue can be resolved with a data revision, rather than entering a response in the comment box, you resolve this issue by selecting the button View Related Form, and you revise the numbers in the A10 forms. With all of the open issues addressed, you are now ready to submit the original submission. You can do this by selecting the button Submit Annual Report Package in the top right corner of the Report Package Summary page, or you can open the Related Actions menu and select the Submit option from there. As a reminder for the annual report, only your agency's CEO or CEO delegate users may submit this version of the report. Once the report enters the revision cycle, starting with revision 1, the NTD contact may begin resubmitting the report. The report will not successfully submit if any of the following circumstances occur. So if there are any unresolved open issues on the forms, if there are forms that have not been saved and validated, or if there are any required fields in any of the report forms that have not been completed. Once all of the issues are resolved, select Continue to proceed with submitting the report. The final confirmation page will display a summary of your report. For state DOT reporters, you will see a page showing your subrecipient aggregate service data and some basic agency information. For all other reporter types, you will be asked to confirm the accuracy of the CEO certification or D10 form. Now that the original submission has been submitted, the validation analyst will review the data contained in the report, and they will also review the comments submitted for the open issues. So thinking back to our 3 examples from the original submission, let's see how the analyst approached each of these issues during their review. When analysts validate the annual NTD report, they can interact with the validation issues in a few different ways. One is that they will close any issues that are listed as open with explanation if the agency's comment sufficiently addresses the issue. However, they may opt to keep those issues listed as open if the issue maybe requires some clarification or more information, or if the data requires a revision. Finally, analysts may manually add new issues to the report for any issues that the automated validation software did not catch. Let's look at our first example from the original submission. So the local funds were reported as $10,000. The agency's comment states that this amount is exactly what the agency spent from local sources during the fiscal year period. This response sufficiently confirms the reported data, so the analyst adds an OK note and closes the issue. This issue would not appear as an outstanding action item during the agency's revision 1. Let's look at our second example. The agency reported a $0 demand response fare on the B15 form and confirmed during validation that the reported value was correct. So remember the hint that the RR20 form reflected a non-zero fare amount for the demand response mode, which creates an unexpected difference between these forms. If you reported that this mode collected fares on the RR20 form, it seems unusual for the B15 form to reflect $0 as the most commonly charged fare. The analyst would keep this issue listed as open, and the agency would need to provide more information or revise the data during their revision 1. And you can see the analyst comment in the screenshot shown on the slide. In the third example, the maintenance facilities were incorrectly prorated to equal 1.25 total facilities when it should have been 1. Because you revised the data in the A10 forms prior to submitting this report, the analyst would neither close the issue nor keep it as open. However, analysts can still review issues that are closed with data revision since the system retains a record of those issues. Analysts may opt to reopen an issue that is closed with data revision if the revision prompts a separate issue or requires an explanation. So we have reviewed the 3 examples from the original submission, but we will introduce one more scenario to this report, and those are manually added validation issues. NTD analysts can add custom validation issues to the report forms since the automated validation cannot identify 100% of data issues in a given report. If agencies receive manual validation issues in their report revisions, they must respond to them in the same manner that they respond to the system-generated issues, that is, resolving them either by providing an explanation or by revising the data. Looking back at our example report, let's say that while the analyst is reviewing this report, they notice that you reported funds to the category Other Federal Funds, and most other categories in the NTD report require a text description. So in your description, you explain that these funds came from your FTA 5307 grant, and that is shown in the first screenshot on the slide. Since 5307 funds have their own funding category, the analyst would manually add a validation issue instructing you to move the funds to the 5307 category, and that new validation issue appears in the second screenshot. When you receive the report back, starting with the revision 1, your list of validation issues may contain a combination of new manually added issues and previous issues from the original submission that the analyst opted to keep open. You can see each of these issue types on the slide here. The first issue is that B15 check asking about the $0 demand response fare. And the second issue is the manually added issue asking about the 5307 funding reported to the incorrect category. You may not always remember the complete list of issues from your last report revision, so if you ever need to check whether your analyst has recently added a comment or not, you should always select the validation issue and scroll down to the validation correspondence. The comment history will contain the discussion between you and your analyst, and you can check to see if your analyst has recently added a new comment to that issue. In this example, you selected the issue for no fare charged, and you scroll down to the comment history, and you can see the analyst has added a comment asking about the data conflict with the RR20 form. NTD reports will continue to be submitted by the agency and returned by the analyst until all of the validation issues are resolved. Once all of the issues are closed, the analyst will then elevate the report for closeout review. The report will then undergo another level of review from the quality assurance team before the report is sent to FTA. It is possible for the QA team to return the report back to the analyst with follow-up questions or requests for clarification. If that happens, the analyst will follow up with the agency, and the agency must provide responses to those questions as part of the standard validation process. Here's a quick visual about the NTD reporting process, starting with the initial data entry period. During the validation cycle, including the first NTD review, the analyst identifies issues with the report. If there are no outstanding data issues once the report is finalized, the report will undergo what is called a clean closeout. This essentially means the report is accepted by FTA without any outstanding data issues that would need to be addressed in the following report year. On the other hand, if your report does contain outstanding issues that cannot be resolved in the current year, the report would be closed with the issues noted on the closeout letter. Some examples of this include any data points for which you might request a data waiver, or any data points that FTA deemed questionable for that report year. If you have any questions about waivers or questionable notations, please reach out to your NTD analyst. If your agency completes monthly or weekly report forms, such as the monthly ridership or MR20 forms, safety and security or SNS forms, or the weekly reference or WE20 form, validation works in a similar manner. So all of these forms require validation responses similar to the annual report forms. This is looking at the WE20 form as an example. You can view the validation issues for this form by selecting the View Issues button at the bottom of each form. You can then respond to the issues by revising the data or entering a comment. So that concludes our overview of the validation process as it pertains to the annual reporting cycle. We will now look at 10 sort of validation best practice tips for engaging with NTD validation. As a reminder, the purpose of validating NTD data is to ensure the accuracy of that data, as well as understanding transit agencies' unique operating characteristics. Validation is not intended to imply that the reported data is incorrect. When you respond to validation, ensure that you provide responses that address any annual service changes that have occurred at your agency, or speak to any broader historical trends if you are able. Your validation analyst may not be familiar with your agency's specific transit characteristics in detail, so any information you can provide can help them understand it better. Tip number 1 is to provide clear validation responses. This means you should avoid providing sort of generic or vague responses such as the data is correct. If a validation check fires, especially a check asking about year-over-year data changes, the response data is correct does not really provide information about why the data changed from the previous year. Your analyst would likely keep that issue open and ask for more information in these cases. In this example, the vehicle revenue miles for the bus mode increased by 32% this year. The slide shows an example of this validation check that fired in the reporting system. So think about why your bus service expanded from last year. In this case, it's because you implemented a new bus route in January of the current reporting period, plus you expanded weekend service hours. In response to this validation check, you would provide this context to explain the increase in vehicle revenue miles. Tip number 2 is to respond to the most recent validation issue during the revision cycle. When your analyst reviews the very first submission of the report, they will review each of your comments and either close the issue or keep it open. If they opt to keep an issue open, they will add an analyst comment to that issue. This means that if you receive your report back from your analyst and you see a validation issue that you think you may have already responded to, you should open the issue to review the most recent analyst comment. Let's look at an example from the A30 form. In this example, you reported 0 active vehicles in a given revenue vehicle fleet, which prompts a validation check asking if the fleet should be marked as retired. As a reminder, you should mark fleets as retired if they have been sold or disposed of as of fiscal year end. This validation issue is shown in the first screenshot here. In response to this check, you enter a comment stating that the vehicles were in fact sold by fiscal year end. You add that the vehicles were not in your agency's possession for this current reporting period. And that comment is shown in the second screenshot. When your analyst reviews this issue, they will notice that the fleet should actually be marked as retired in the system, since your comment confirms the vehicles were sold during the fiscal year. In this example, the analyst has kept the validation issue listed as open for the revision 1, and they added a comment stating, "Your comment indicates that this fleet should be marked as retired. Please open the A30 form, locate the question, is this fleet retired, and revise your response to yes." When you first pull up the open issues during the revision 1, you will see the same issue summary for this particular validation check. You should select the issue and scroll down to review the analyst's most recent comment. You should not re-enter the same response that you provided during the original submission. In this case, the analyst had requested that you mark the fleet as retired in the A30 form, so you should select View Related Form to revise this data. Tip number 3 is that you should provide responses that address each validation issue independently. If several validation issues fire for a particular form, you should in most cases provide unique responses to each issue. You should avoid copying and pasting the same explanation across multiple issues unless that response accurately addresses all of those issues. In this example, 2 validation issues have fired for the RR20 form. One issue asks about the vehicle revenue miles for the demand response mode increasing from the last report year. The second issue asks about the average demand response passenger fare changing from $2.44 last year to $1.43 this year. As a reminder, the NTD calculates average passenger fare by dividing the fare revenues for a particular mode by the unlinked passenger trips for that mode. Looking at the first validation issue, which is that the vehicle revenue miles increased, you provide a response stating that a new healthcare clinic opened in town at the beginning of this fiscal year period, which led to an increase in demand response trip requests. The issue summary and the agency response are shown in the screenshots here. The overall increase in demand response service does not necessarily explain why the average passenger fare would have decreased from last year. You should address this validation issue separately with its own unique explanation. In this case, the comment on the screen states that the agency saw an increase in fare-free passengers, including seniors and passengers with disabilities, as a result of the new healthcare facility opening in the area. Since this year's ridership consisted of more fare-free passengers, the ratio of fares to trips decreased this year. If you had provided the same response that you had given for the VRM increase, which is just that a new passenger destination opened in the area, your analyst likely would have kept the fare revenue check open and asked for more information. Tip number 4 is to avoid placeholder comments in validation. Responding to validation issues is a requirement for the annual NTD report, and the FTA considers a report to be incomplete if it does not contain sufficient validation responses. In some cases, you may not be sure of what a validation check is asking or how you should resolve it, so you may need to ask your analyst for clarification. In these cases, you should reach out to your analyst first before you enter a comment in the issue. In this example, a validation issue fired on the A90 form, which is the Transit Asset Management Performance Measure Targets form. Let's say you did not upload your agency's narrative report to the form before hitting Save and Validate. The narrative report is required each report year, so a validation check fires as a result. If you weren't familiar with this requirement, you might reach out to your analyst to request more information about this validation issue. You should avoid requesting assistance directly in the validation comment, which is shown in the screenshot on the slide. The comment states, "I am not familiar with this requirement and am not sure what this check is asking for. Please explain what I need to do to resolve this issue." In this case, you should email or call your analyst first, then address the issue once you have more information. Tip number 5 is to provide mode-specific responses. If your agency operates 2 or more modes, validation checks will likely fire for a specific mode on your report. When this occurs, you should provide responses that address service changes for that particular mode. In this example, 2 validation issues have fired, both related to changes in vehicle revenue miles. The first issue asks about a VRM increase for the bus mode. The second issue asks about a VRM increase for the demand response mode. In this example, the VRM has increased for both modes. The VRM for the bus mode increased as a result of route expansions and additional evening service, which is shown in the comment here. In this example, the agency opened the VRM validation issue for the bus mode and entered a response stating, "We expanded 3 of our weekday routes to include additional stops, and our evening routes now end at 10 p.m. instead of 8 p.m. as per prior years." You should provide a separate response for the demand response mode's validation check. You should not provide the same response as the bus check, which is shown here. As a reminder, the validation issue details will provide the mode and type of service related to that issue. You can see it listed on the mode/type of service row towards the top of the screenshot, and you can also see it listed in the validation information language at the bottom of the screenshot. To correct this, the agency instead enters a comment for the DRDO validation check stating, "We procured an additional vehicle and hired another full-time driver and were able to operate more service as a result." This response specifically addresses the annual changes for the demand response mode to explain the increased service. Tip number 6 is that you should revise the data in the report if needed. If you need to revise the report data, please ensure that you do so prior to resubmitting the report. You should avoid simply entering a comment that states the data should be revised without making that change in the report form. Here's an example from the A30 form. Let's say you reported standing capacity as 0 for one of your revenue vehicle fleets. When standing capacity is reported as 0, a validation issue will fire to confirm that this data is correct as reported, or it could indicate that you may need to revise the data. Let's say that you realized that standing capacity should actually be reported as a non-zero value. In the screenshot above, the response states that this was an initial error in the report and that standing capacity should be reported as 15 rather than 0. The A30 form should show the correct value, but it currently shows 0. In this case, you should first return to the A30 form, update standing capacity to 15, and then save and validate the issue. And because this issue fired automatically by the reporting system, when you revise this field to a non-zero number, the issue will clear automatically and change to closed with data revision. If you were to have submitted the report with standing capacity still reported as 0, the analyst would have returned the report with instructions to update this data. Tip number 7 is to consider what we call ratio calculations. Some of the NTD validation compares 2 data points against each other to determine an annual average. So for example, the system compares your reported vehicle revenue miles against your reported vehicle revenue hours to get an average operating speed or miles per hour. When these types of validation issues fire, it means that the rate of these 2 data points have changed from the previous report year. Let's look at an example from the RR20 form. In year 1, so the previous report year, this agency reported a little under $1 million in operating expenses for the fiscal year period. They also reported 21,430 vehicle revenue hours. Dividing the operating expenses by the vehicle revenue hours provides an average operating cost per revenue hour, which in year 1 was $46.28 per hour. In year 2, the current report year, they reported a noticeable decrease in operating expenses, just under $600,000, but relatively consistent vehicle revenue hours. Because the expenses decreased while the hours did not significantly change, the average operating cost in year 2 was $29.62 per hour. So the average operating cost decreased by 36% in year 2. A validation check would fire in this case, asking about the decrease in the average cost per hour. You can see the averages for year 1 and year 2 listed at the bottom of this screenshot in the validation information section. Again, the change in this ratio is mostly driven by the decrease in expenses, which is highlighted in the table. So you should enter a comment that primarily addresses why the expenses decreased for this service. The comment in the screenshot states, "This year, we retired several older vehicle fleets, which had previously accounted for high maintenance costs. We are also operating with less staff this year, thus fewer funds were expended for salaries and wages." This explanation addresses why the operating costs were a little bit higher in the previous year. So there were higher maintenance costs, as well as more staffing-related costs last year. This response sufficiently addresses the change to this ratio calculation. Tip number 8 is to minimize room for interpretation. Your validation analyst cannot make any guesses or assumptions about your validation responses. They can only work with the information that you provide. So you should provide clear and thorough responses that don't leave any ambiguity about what you mean or what you're referring to. If you provide an explanation that refers to specific reporting periods, such as this year or last year, you should include them in your explanation. In this example, the vehicle revenue miles for the demand response mode increased from 182,094 last year to 275,822 this year, which is an increase of over 50%. The response to this check states, 2 of our main vehicles had ongoing mechanical issues and were out for major repairs. We also had a driver shortage for 4 months of the year, leading to a reduction in service. So as a reminder, the vehicle revenue miles had increased this year, but the comment related to mechanical issues and the driver shortage implies that the agency operated less service than expected. Does this response mean that the service disruptions occurred last year, but were resolved this year, leading to the increase in service? It's reasonable to assume that that is what the comment meant, but it's not made immediately clear in the response, and so the analyst could not assume that this is what you meant. The screenshot above shows some newly added details in the validation response so that it now reads, 2 of our main vehicles had ongoing mechanical issues and were out for major repairs last year. We also had a driver shortage for 4 months of the year, leading to a reduction in service. This year, we had a full 12 months of standard operations. So these added details now make it clear that these service disruptions did occur last year and were resolved by this year. Tip number 9 is to explain any prior year data issues if they are applicable. While completing this year's NTD report, you might discover that there was an error in last year's report. If last year's error is a main contributor for a validation issue firing this year, you should explain what the issue was. For example, was there a data entry error in last year's report, such as a typo or data being transposed between 2 fields? Did the report contain non-reportable data, such as deadhead or driver training? Or did it possibly omit some data that should have been reported? Or did the report contain less than 12 months of data? Or did a previous contact potentially misunderstand the reporting requirements? These responses all provide useful information for how the data was previously reported incorrectly. You should avoid simply stating last year's data was incorrect if you are able to provide additional context. If you happen to have the correct value on hand, you should provide it so that your analyst can validate this year's data against the correct value from last year. This example looks at a validation issue which compares vehicles operated in maximum service, or VOMs, against the vehicle revenue miles reported each year. Comparing the VOMs against the VRM provides an average number of miles each vehicle operated annually. So in year 1, you reported 25 VOMs and a little over 182,000 miles. This yields an average of 7,284 miles per vehicle in year 1. In year 2, you reported 20 VOMs, but a slight increase in vehicle revenue miles. This yields an average of 9,707 miles per vehicle in year 2, which is a 33% increase from the previous year. Again, looking at the table, this was driven by the decrease in VOMs in year 2. A validation check fires asking about the increase in this average. While you review your historical records, you notice that the 25 VOMs reported last year was actually based on your total revenue vehicle fleet size and not the number of vehicles actually operated during peak service. So as a reminder, you should report VOMs based on the number of vehicles that are actually operated during peak service periods and not necessarily the number of vehicles that are simply available to provide service. Based on the historical records, you determine that last year's VOMs should have been reported as 19 instead of 25. So in the first screenshot shown here, the comment simply states, last year's data was incorrect. This comment does not provide much information about which data point was correct, since this check again looks at both the miles and the vehicle count, and it also does not provide much information about why the data was incorrect. The second screenshot shows a comment that states, last year's reported VOMs were based on the highest number of vehicles available for service, not the highest number of vehicles operated during maximum service. Last year's VOMs should have been 19 and not 25. Coming back to our table for a moment, the analyst would compare this year's data against last year's correct values, which in this case was 19 VOMs rather than 25. Comparing last year's true VOMs to the VRM, the average miles per vehicle should have actually been 9,584, which is much more consistent to what you reported this year. So the analyst would close this issue and note that the VOMs were overreported in the previous year. Tip number 10, the final validation tip, is to comment on analyst-created issues to clear them. When your analyst manually adds validation issues to the report, the issue will not automatically close if you happen to revise the data. If you revise your data and notice that an issue is still listed as open and the validation information does not change, then you should enter a comment in order to change the issue to open with explanation. In this example, you reported funds to the field other directly generated funds. And again, most other categories require a written description of those funds. You write in the description box that these funds came from demand response no-show fines. The NTD policy manual states that no-show fines should be reported under the passenger paid fares category. During the analyst's review, they manually add a validation issue stating that these funds are currently reported to the incorrect field. The analyst's issue states, you have reported other directly generated funds with the description demand response no-show fines. These funds should be reported under demand response passenger paid fares. Please revise the data. After you move the funds and select Save and Validate, you will see that the issue still appears listed as open, even though you revised the data. The reporting system cannot automatically change manually added issues to closed with data revision, even if the updated data satisfies the issue. And this is because the reporting software does not know what conditions must be met in order to consider the issue resolved. So in these cases, you should enter a brief comment stating the data has been revised, funds have been moved to passenger paid fares. This will change the issue to open with explanation and will allow you to resubmit the report. That concludes our presentation this afternoon. We'd like to just take a moment to remind our audience that validation analysts are here as a reporting resource for agencies. Analysts can help you by providing reporting guidance or policy clarification or technical assistance with the online reporting system. We can also point you to supplemental resources like the NTD policy manual, the NTD glossary, recordings of past webinars, or the annual data publications. Every agency has an NTD point of contact that we encourage you to call or email should you have any questions during the report year. Don't hesitate to reach out to your analyst with questions because we are here to help. Looking ahead to the report year 2024, your analyst will reach out to you with some helpful materials. The analysts have already sent the closeout summary from report year 2023 containing last year's closeout letter. If the closeout letter contains any data notations such as waivers or questionable items, your analyst will follow up on these items during this year's report validation. Your analyst will also reach out with the 2024 welcome email containing some helpful reporting tips and tools, as well as a checklist you can refer to while completing your report. For agencies in the January and April reporting groups, you can expect to receive the welcome email from your analyst around the start of your new fiscal year. For agencies in the October reporting group, you can expect to hear from your analyst around mid-September. Here's the contact information again for the NTD Operations Center, as well as myself, Melody, and the NTD program contacts. Thank you all again for joining us this afternoon, and I will hand it over to Lori to close us out.
Hi, everyone. Just a quick check. There is one question still in the Q&A box. I'll read it since we're here. If we discover that the data was incorrectly... Oh, Melody, you're typing an answer right now. Okay. Well, I guess everybody wants to hear the answer now. The question was, if we discover the data was incorrectly reported a prior year, does this impact the previous year's annual report? And guess we'll stay tuned for the answer since it's being typed. Melody?
I'll just go ahead and answer.
Okay.
Hi, Riley. It's good to see you here. If you discover that data was incorrectly reported in a prior year, just reach out to your analyst and let us know which data points were incorrect and what data should have been reported. That will be helpful for us when we're reviewing current and future reports. So we'll have a better idea of what data trends we're looking for, and that won't cause any extra issues if we see that data has been changing unexpectedly. That will be noted in your closeout letter each year if any incorrect data points have been discovered and have been reported to us, but please just let us know. That does help us keep track of what we're looking for in your reports each year.